Welcome back to our Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek, and back with me is our senior analyst, Laurence Sanford.
Nice to be back,
Welcome
Joy.
back, Larry. And today we're going to discuss South Africa's connection to Hamas and the Palestinian plight in Gaza. Larry wrote an article in January titled South Africa Supports Hamas. You can find all of Larry's articles at our website, www.ascf.us. Please consider becoming a member of the ASCF for $100 a year. That's less than $10 a month, and you will have a paid subscription to Substack along with our newsletter. Larry, in your article, my first question is, you had talked about the ANC, the African National Congress, and in your, go ahead.
It's the ruling party in South Africa.
Currently. So in your opinion, why did South African relations with Israel deteriorate when they took over power?
Like so many things in life, it's complicated.
Okay.
And there's a history involved. Of course, I think the world had sympathy for the ruling party, the African National Congress, because for years, I guess maybe centuries even, South Africa was ruled by whites when the majority of the people were black, and the apartheid regime of they were historically from Holland. They were Boers, Dutch descendants, and they ruled South Africa, and they had this horrible policy of apartheid, which basically segregated people based on their color. Sort of what we're sort of heading back to here in America now, where I thought segregation was a thing of the past. It's happening more and more in America, so who knows what's going to happen here in the United States. But anyhow, eventually they lost. The South African whites gave up without too much fighting. There was repression, but they gave up without a civil war anyways. Rulership, and the African National Congress took over. The problem is all those years of suppression by the Dutch, Boers, the Communist Party was on the side of the blacks because they see the blacks as a minority group that they could use to incite and revolutionize. So they developed deep inroads, as they have done here in America with the black society. The Marxists have anyways. Deep inroads in the ruling party of the African National Congress. So when they took over, the communist Marxists had an outsized influence on the governance of South Africa. And they, in turn, support the Palestinian cause because it's in the interest of Marxism to support the downtrodden. At one time, it was the bourgeois versus the proletariat. Now it's a racial thing. Marxism is based on race. And so the Palestinians are downtrodden according to Marxism because of the oppressor, namely the Jews. And so they have this support within South Africa of the Communist Party. And there's also within the ANC itself, by itself, the sympathy of a subjected people, according to the Marxists anyways, and the Palestinians, that they're subjected to suppression and segregation and apartheid by the Jews in Israel. So there's that whole complex issues of who's telling the truth and what the reality is, but the reality is that Marxist communism in South Africa have an outsized influence. They, in turn, support the Palestinian cause, and the ANC, in turn, supports the Palestinian cause. And so Hamas is part of the whole Palestinian equation. So South Africa supports Hamas, even though, Hamas murdered 1,200 Israelis. But they don't mention that. They just mention the apartheid of Israel.
And I'm going to get to the apartheid and to the genocide that you were speaking
Yeah, and of course they never mention that 20% of the Israeli citizens are Arab Muslims.
So South Africa filed genocide against Israel at the United Nations, as you state in your article.
Yes.
And South Africa has been known to compare the Palestinian situation to their own apartheid under majority rule, as we just talked about.
Yes.
And I understand Nelson Mandela was part of the ANC, and he was a supporter of the Palestinians, but he also was a supporter of a two-state solution.
Yes.
Do you think Nelson Mandela's grandson, Mandela,
Mandela,
as you stated in your article, would support a two-state solution?
I think so. He supports the Palestinian cause. And Nelson Mandela was a human being, a man. And like so many things, he was a wonderful man in many respects, but he certainly, in my opinion, had a blind spot in regards to the Palestinian cause. I mean, he was sort of like a Martin Luther King. Gandhi was one of his idols. And, you know, he was in prison for over 20 years. Mm-hmm. And he came out of prison smiling and working with the whites to form a new government without hate and vindictiveness. And of course, that's slowly changing with the communists. And there's more and more talk of confiscating all the whites' properties and buildings and everything else. I mean, if I were a white in Africa, I'd be getting the heck out of there as fast as I could.
That's why I asked about his grandson being open to the two-state solution, because we know he invited Hamas to the last event they had there, and we know Hamas is not really in favor of a two-state solution.
No, they're for total elimination of Israel and the Jews.
And in your summary here, you had stated that why do so many countries and organizations demonize Israel? Western civilization should be defending the right for Israel to exist, as Judaism is a foundational block in Western civilization's concept of individual freedoms and social care. Do you believe the state of Israel is demonized because people or governments see them as an extension of British rule in the Middle East?
Goes back 1,400 years to Islam, that basically the Middle East 1,400 years ago was mostly Christian and Jewish. Mm-hmm. But once the Muslims conquered that part of the world, they consider that part of the world to be theirs forever. Mm. So this whole flap in Jerusalem about the mosque, the Golden Dome Mosque, was built on top of a Jewish temple. It's typical Islamic conquest that, and India is going through this right now. There's all sorts of problems in India because the Indian Hindus now are saying we want to rebuild our temples that were torn down by the Muslim invaders and built mosques there. So they just tore down a mosque a few years ago and rebuilt in Ayodhya, India, a marvelous Hindu temple, and it's causing all sorts of strife. And there's 120, 130, 40 million Muslims in India, so they have a huge problem on their hand in regards to the Muslims versus the Hindus. But the Hindus are on the winning side because they get the numbers out of a nation of 1.4 billion. They're in the definitely majority. But I guess the answer to your question is it goes back 1,400 years, and Muslims do not want a non-Muslim nation in the middle of their territory. Simple as that, really, in my opinion. Okay. And of course, the Quran has numerous passages that are pretty anti-Israeli Jewish, the violence. So it goes. I don't know what you do about it.
Yeah, well, that would be my next question on our Peace Through Strength solutions. Do you think there's a possibility for a two-state solution there, considering everything that's going on?
I could argue there's already two states that the so-called Palestinians that have gone from 700,000 from 1948 war are now 5 or 6 million. Stop sending them money and they will be absorbed into Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt, and you don't need a two-state solution. If I were Israel, I would not give up the West Bank. I mean, Israel's just a speck of a nation. I mean, if they gave up the West Bank, which is the border from, when you hear that phrase, river to sea, that's the river is the Jordan River to the sea is basically all of Israel. So if they gave up that territory, they would be really vulnerable to invasion, even more so with the rockets coming down from Lebanon now and from Gaza.
Yep, and that's another discussion for another day of Hezbollah in the north and the West Bank area. But what are they going to do with Gaza once I've heard they've rooted out a lot of the tunnels. So.
Yeah. But there's some movement going on in the Middle East too. I mean, you know, during the Trump administration, they signed the Abraham Accords, and you know, there's some movement towards acknowledging that maybe Israel has a right to exist. So, if you hang in there long enough, maybe some good things can happen. On the other hand, maybe bad things can happen. So,
I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. But if you don't have a credible defense and military response capability, they're going to walk all over you. And Israel has a very good military. Yeah.
Yes, they do, as we can see.
Yeah.
And you also stated that reciprocity. The U.S. should file genocide charges against Hamas. And I would even take it a step farther, should Israel file genocide charges against
Probably
Hamas?
more yeah. I'm a big fan of reciprocity in the U.S. foreign policies, and if people don't treat us well, then we shouldn't treat them well. I don't understand why in the current negotiations for aid to Ukraine, Israel, and they're going to put in, what, $9 billion for aid to Gaza? I wouldn't send a nickel to any of those Palestinian organizations. Let the Brotherhood of Muslims take care of their own. And all we're doing is continuing to support the festering of the UNRWA, relief organization. And it's solely devoted to the Palestinians. It's unique, and all it does is fester and foster anti-Israel, anti-Western dogma.
And we now know that at least 12 of them were compliant in the Hamas.
Yeah, and the U.S. has some leverage against South Africa. I think there's a residual of goodwill towards South Africa by, I'd say, the vast majority of the Western world after what they were subjected to all those years. But there's $3 billion worth of trade that South Africa has with the United States that enters the U.S. duty-free. So we have some leverage, and I say if people don't treat us right, why should we go out of our way to treat them well? So, and if you want to be in the communist orb, be my guest. And they're doing that with BRICS. As you know, they're one of the founding. They're one of the founding fathers or mothers of BRICS, which stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And it's a consortium countries that want to get away from the U.S. dollar. And can't say I blame them. They want to have their alternative. Monopolies aren't necessarily good, and the U.S. reserve as a dollar is a monopolistic situation, almost. It's gradually withering away. And it's certainly not going to work to our advantage as the U.S. dollar goes down. But on the other hand, if I were those countries, I'd probably be working on trying to have a little competition in the world of money. So,
understandably.
Yeah, understandably, in my opinion.
So, thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Joy.
I appreciate your comments on your article. And to our listeners, you can read Larry's article at our website, www.ascf.us. Please comment on his article. Please also bring your thoughts on a two-state solution and the demonization of Jews in the state of Israel. You can comment on our YouTube and Rumble channels. Please also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And consider becoming a member of the American Security Council Foundation for $100 a year, which will include a year paid subscription to Substack, which Larry also writes on.
Yes.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you to our listeners. And join us again next time as we bring you Peace Through Strength podcast.